In this video, let's learn about binding to root values. In the previous video, we have seen this. We created a map get, and we created a get endpoint handler here that maps to this particular root template. And we're using this parameter so that this parameter can be bound to the root value here. This is called implicit binding. In fact, you can be explicit and saying from root, just like this. So when you say this, you basically explicitly expressing that you want to bind this particular parameter to this particular parameter. And when ASP.NET Core sees this, it knows where to find the corresponding data source. But how does it know which root value to use? It uses the parameter name. So you have to have this parameter name corresponds to the root parameter name. Let's actually try to complete this coding here. We have the implementation about returning the employee information right here. We are going to actually just copy the code right here. Let's copy this comment as well. Okay, and instead of using employee ID, we need to use the ID here directly from the parameter. And now once we have the employee information, keep in mind that we are really dealing with minimal API right now. So we don't have access to the context object anymore. And we can directly actually return this employee. And because we are using minimal API, and usually APIs return JSON back to the client. So therefore, when we just try to return the .NET object like this, right? This is a .NET object. It's going to be serialized into JSON directly so that the client can use it. But because the client is actually a browser in this case, therefore, this JSON information is actually going to be displayed directly in the browser. So let's give it a try. Let's run the application. And let's go to employees/1. You can slash anything, but it has to be within the in-memory data store. So let's take the first one, which is John Doe. And you can see that the JSON is directly displayed inside the browser. And I'm using Chrome, which has this pretty print. You can check it and you can see that everything is formatted. Okay. And if we go to F12, you will see, let's go to network and refresh it to rerun it and highlight this and go to response tab here, because if you go to header, you don't see the response body. Now this is the response body, which contains a valid JSON. And that's why it's displayed in the browser like this. And if you check this, you can see it's formatted properly for you, just for display purpose. All right, so let's go back. Now you can see that we can specifically specify where the data source is for this particular endpoint handler parameter. But the name has to correspond to this. What if you have a different name? Let's say this is ID. We don't call it ID. We call it identity number. Let's just call it this for now. And copy and paste it over here. Now let's try to execute and see what happens. All right. Now you can directly see that it throws an exception. It says that identity number is not a root parameter. So you can see ASP.NET Core really tries to find the root value parameter, like the root parameter, directly by following the name. So this has to exist in the root parameter. Otherwise, it throws exception. However, sometimes you may have a name, the root parameter name here, that you really don't want to use. For example, you name this as ID, but here you just want to use identity number, right? Because for some reason it makes more sense in your coding, but ID here makes more sense in the URL. So there must be a way to map these two together, and there is indeed a way. So in the from root, there is a parameter, and you can say name is, in this case, ID. So what it's trying to say is that although this is called identity number, now I'm looking for a root parameter based on the name right here in this attribute. So if I do it this way, then the identity number is different from this. That's not a problem anymore. So let's run it. And now let's go to /employee/1, and you can see we get the correct employee information. If I go /employee/3, I can also get Sam Brown. All right, so that's how you use the from root to explicitly bind a endpoint parameter to a root parameter. And if the name for some reason is different, then you can specifically specify the name like this. Now let's talk about what if the type doesn't correspond to each other. For example, this one is an integer in here, but this one, you for some reason want it to be date time. Okay, so let's actually comment this out just to demonstrate this. Okay, so let's say this is a date time, and you just want to return identity number just like this. And if we run it this way, what's going to happen is different from routing. So let's go to employees/1. Now we get a bad HTTP request. So what is this HTTP status code? So let's go to F12 and run this again. And now you can see this is 400. This is client side error. HTTP 400, and the status description of this is bad request from the client side. Okay, so if you recall what happens in the constraint for ASP.NET Core routing, routing, if the constraint doesn't match, what happens is that it doesn't find the corresponding endpoint handler, therefore it goes to 404, not found. In this case, if the data type doesn't correspond to each other, the error that we get is HTTP 400 bad request. It indicates that the user provided wrong information. So that's what I want to point out right here. So let's delete the code and recover. Now the last thing I want to talk about in this video is that if your root parameter here is optional, right? In this case, you add a question mark, indicates that you don't have to provide the ID here. Then what's going to happen if you don't provide? So let's run the application and observe what's going to happen here. Well, in this case, of course, it's going to actually map to this one, and perhaps it's going to throw exception. Let's temporarily comment out this endpoint here and run the application again. And let's go to /employees, and now we see HTTP request exception. This again is a bad request because it says this is a required parameter, right? So this one is required, but this one is optional. So in this case, what you need to do is to make this one also optional. So give it a question mark, then we can continue. But of course, if this is nullable, then this one we're having a problem here. The get employee, you can see the definition of this repository method here. It requires an ID here, right? So of course, in this case, you will have to do something like identity. If identity number is not now, or is a hash value, then this is what we are going to do. We're going to do this. Otherwise, we're going to just return null. And in here, we can say identity number dot value. So we can do something like this. Just to remember that if you have optional root parameter, just make the endpoint handler parameter also optional. So let's run this and see what we get here. All right, so let's go to /employees, and now we see null. Why we see null? Because we didn't provide anything for the identity number, because we didn't provide the ID over here. It doesn't extract value from here to here anymore. Therefore, identity number has no value, and we're returning null, just like this. And that's everything I want to cover in this video. I think I will revert the code like this, and then this will become your source code for this lesson. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.